The portrait is of Austin Clarke, a Black Canadian who immigrated to Canada from Barbados in 1955. He attended the University of Toronto, eventually worked as a journalist, but ultimately focused on writing essays, fiction, nonfiction, and poetry. Clarke was made a member of the Order of Canada in 1998 and won the Scotiabank Giller Prize and the Trillium Book Award for his book, The Polished Hoe, in 2002.
I am pleased to announce that Austin Clarke is the winner of the 2003 Giller Prize.
His first novel, Survivors of the Crossing, in 1964, has been described as the first blast of the trumpet from an author who resolutely rejected the accepted pieties of Canadian writing and projected his own individual vision and voice, a voice steeped in Caribbean rhythms and dialects, onto his writing.
Certain cultural things will never go away.
In Membering, Clarke's memoir of 2015, he wrote, "I have never held a Canadian writer as a model for my own work. This is simply because the theme and the style of Canadian literature is irrelevant to my work. I am alone, singular, peculiar, and foreign to the establishment that governs and controls Canadian literature."
I was taken aback by some of the things written about my book, that when the book has been written, it becomes the property, in inverted commas, of the whole society. But to misunderstand what the book is saying is a phenomenal error.
It is precisely because of Clarke's insights into complicated societies such as he experienced in Canada that his impact as a writer has been broadly recognized. The portrait of Austin Clarke, interpreted by Canadian artist Neville Clarke, no relation, from various photographs, writings, and connecting with Clarke's family, was commissioned with funds courtesy of the J.W.L. Forster National Portrait Gallery Fund.
Austin Clarke is the first significant post-World War II Black Canadian writer. And he's writing about the kinds of people that at that time weren't imagined to be fundamental to the tapestry of what makes Canada. So he very early begins to write about Caribbean domestics, about unemployed Black men, and the struggles that they are undergoing to try to make a life for themselves in Canada.
I found that extraordinary, that someone would do that, essentially because my mother was one of those Black workers from the Caribbean who came to Toronto in the 60s. But I had no idea someone had what I thought then was the audacity to write those stories. Austin Clarke wrote those stories.
I just thought that someone was making a sound familiar to me, that resonated deep in my bones, that spoke in the kind of Caribbeanist dialect that I was born into and raised in. And certainly that homeward sound opened up a great deal for me as a young writer, as someone learning to write and practicing writing and engaging in reading across, such varied styles and schools and traditions. Austin Clarke certainly was among the writers who felt like home to me.
Austin Clarke is a trailblazer for myself as a journalist and for so many of us as people of words, for people who have made the journey from places in the Caribbean, including Barbados, but not just Barbados, who see him as being able to translate the language of his home through the experiences of characters in places like Toronto.
I knew him for, a good 20, 25 years, so it was a long friendship. Austin and I spent countless hours at Bistro 990 on Bay Street. We would sometimes arrive there at noon and have lunch and not leave until 1 a.m. when they closed. And some years into that hangout, Google was at the time mapping the streets of Toronto. We showed up on the Google map. My friends would make a lot of fun about us for that. But and Bistro 990, as you probably know, was a very interesting place where a lot of Canada's writers passed through on a daily basis.
He was an incredibly generous individual. He always had time to speak to people like me, newer writers, about the craft and demands of writing. He always had an encouraging word. He asked oftentimes about my last novel. He died before I could finish it, but I did dedicate it to him as a tribute to his effect on me. I think he's someone that so many writers working now will continue to remember and cherish for a long time.
I am one of so many people in the literary and journalistic worlds who are doing what we're doing today in part because of what Austin Clarke did before us.
He's really set up a template for how we could begin to live better and differently together. And all I can say is that I thank him every day for having existed.
The ROM is an institution that was founded more than a century ago. It has colonial roots. And part of what we're trying to do today is making this an institution that is welcoming and engaging to all. And part of that means making sure that people can see themselves reflected in our galleries and on our walls.
What became very apparent was that there was no highly visible Black presence in the gallery. And so we're embarking upon a way of trying to be more inclusive in the gallery.
It's still important to remember museums are institutions that are about legacy and about taking care of those practitioners that have contributed to culture. So I feel that this work represents that positive move towards recognizing the full diversity of what Canada is.
The Forster National Portrait Gallery had a number of Canadian authors in it. And so I thought it would be a really opportune moment to actually focus on a Black Canadian author to become part of that group of portraits. And so I decided that I would commission a work. So I struck a committee of a number of colleagues within and outside of the museum to see who might be represented in that portrait. So we went through a process of drawing up a short list, and we just discussed a number of the possibilities, and Austin Clarke passed away, and so it just seemed a really wonderful fit. Once it had been decided who the sitter would be, we had to decide who the artist was going to be. At that point, that shifted over to me, and I engaged with Pamela Edmonds.
Capturing the essence of such a remarkable man and person isn't a challenge for any artist to do.
We selected Neville Clarke for a number of reasons, one of which he was a member of the Black community, but also he was a terrific figure painter.
I was familiar with Neville Clarke's practice, but I had the opportunity also to see his exhibition that he curated, which was about bringing awareness of Black Canadian artists to a wider audience. So I felt there was some sensitivity also to the same types of activism and initiatives that Austin Clarke himself was engaged with.
The three of us met to actually look at the other portraits in the National Portrait Gallery, because even though this was separate, he, I think, was conceptualizing the portrait of Austin Clarke in that broader context. In working with members of the community, Pamela Edmonds was a deliberate choice in that way, but also bringing Ronaldo Walcott onto the project.
I became involved after the portrait was created, and the consultation was really one in which to help Arlene and Pam think about how to present Neville's work and how to place that work in a context that people could think about the portrait beyond the image on the wall. The image is supposed to, I think, spark a whole set and series of conversations, not only about Austin Clarke himself, but about broader questions of Black life in Canada.
And so by showing images of someone as important as Austin Clarke, but also very clearly a Black man in a position of importance and centrality, it helps us to do this work of saying there are different voices that we need to be paying attention to, there are different identities that we need to understand, and all of that is part of what we do and what we can experience.
As we celebrate and remember Austin Clarke, I feel gratitude the younger generations of Black writers, activists, and thinkers should read and remember and learn from Austin Clarke. And I feel in this moment especially, Toronto should remember him, because we're in a moment where our city continues to perpetuate suffering against Black folks while calling it something else. And Austin Clarke wrote with great lyricism, but also with great honesty. And we need that honesty and clarity now. Clarke lived in Moss Park and featured it many times in his writing. I imagine that if he could see today the place that he called Moss Park Park, the green space populated with tents of Black people camping out in the cold, that he would do us the service of documenting it with lyricism, precision, and honesty, as he did in his memoir, Membering. Quote, Moss Park Park is where life stretches out itself on its back, prostrate and filthy, hopeless, bouts of heroism and stardom for these men who lie on the benches and the dying grass, are heroes to themselves and one another, in a pecking order that is full of righteous daring and righteous chances of stupidity, like crossing the road in front of speeding cars that put on the brakes at the last minute, on with a squeak. End of quote. We need Clarke's description of Moss Park also in his novel, More, where he tells us that his protagonist, Eudora, can hear, quote, the bells of the church where the men with no homes, with no jobs, with no bedrooms, with no breakfasts, sit in the cold sun. They make her soul light, and they bring back the joy of deliverance, and they seem to justify her affection for this city of Toronto, and for this country of Canada, and for this community of Moss Park. End of quote. We need these words. We who love our city like Eudora, who love the people it refuses to make space for. Clarke, a Black man who thought of himself both as Canadian and Barbadian, a man who twisted his hair, an independent journalist, writer, and thinker, he made space with his work for himself, his contemporaries, and for so many of us who the city continually tries to push out. So I am here as a beneficiary of Clarke's work and sacrifices, which have extended across the decades and echo on after his passing. He knew all too well the challenges of working in the white Canadian literature, journalism, and media landscapes. He knew what it meant to put down one's experiences as a Black person in Canada and to have an editor select the title, Canada's Angriest Black Man. In his memoir, Clarke recalls that a citizenship application he had made was rejected in 1968. He reflects on the moniker of angry and Black in this context, writing, quote, my position and presence in Toronto were therefore categorized and dipped in the ink of unworthiness to be a citizen, end of quote. This analysis of Canada's media framing is so modern and so relevant today that it hurts. Clarke knew of what he spoke and resisted the same obstacles Black people continue to encounter when we take up our condition in this city and country. When I was first invited to see the portrait of Clarke that will live here at the ROM, I was struck by the halo-like effect that it bears. As if the man depicted has descended into the space for a visit from elsewhere. I didn't know Austin Clarke, but as I see him here, I feel like I'm looking at a familiar uncle, a man raised in the Anglican pedagogic tradition, familiar to me as the child of parents from Sierra Leone, a man whose Bayesian vernacular is dancing in his eyes. When literary journalist Donna Bailey Nurse wrote about Clarke's life and career upon his death in 2016, she noted the richness of his professional journey. Freelance journalist, author, cultural attaché, broadcasting executive, political candidate, and a staffer with the Immigration and Refugee Board. Of this last position, Nurse says of Clarke, quote, "He later told me he would never forget the cruelties endured by many of the female refugees," end of quote. In my own recent writing, I've documented the struggle of one such woman, a Black woman from the Caribbean named Beverly, who fought deportation and separation from her husband and baby boy, and who, with the support of Black Lives Matter Toronto and people across the country, was able to remain here with her family. These cruelties persist. And in the spirit of Austin Clarke, we still need to name them and create space for those experiencing them to be seen and heard, to be loved and fought for. Thank you.
Thank you, Neville, for being here today for this interview. You're known primarily as a portrait artist, and you do highly representational paintings, and you work in large part with live models. Given that the great Austin Clarke passed away in 2016, I'm wondering about how you worked on the concept for this painting, given that you didn't have Austin to talk to work with.
Usually, in most cases, I tend to paint and draw from life. I was actually trained that way years ago, and so I work in that way. In this particular case, in terms of creating the portrait of Austin, one of the things I did was I contacted family members, as well as I researched information on the internet, and I also read articles and information about him. So I wanted to get to know who he was. And I spoke with two of his daughters, so we looked through a whole host of different images, and then I was able to contact other people who were photographers who had actually photographed Austin at some point in time. And so I had approximately 25 to 30 images. So I was able to actually study them at some point. And then over time, I started making some sketches just so I could get acquainted with who he was as a person and as an activist as well.
You met him before?
I had met Austin a couple of times in Toronto at the Arts and Letters Club. And so in terms of all the images I used, I had to use certain ones for certain aspects of the face and the features. So some of them had clarity in terms of the features, and then others actually didn't. It was an amalgamation, and it was a process that took time because I had to spend the time to study and then make sure that all those features are drawn right.
You mentioned Rembrandt lighting, which is interesting because the quality of light in this painting is very significant. It's very captivating, and it seems to be a strong feature in the work. So I'm wondering if you could talk about maybe some of your techniques, and then also how you made decisions around the pose and the expression that Austin has in this portrait, because the gaze and the decision for example, how he's looking directly at us, and his expression is really captivating.
Well, I'm glad actually that you said that the image is captivating. It was part of what I wanted to do. In terms of reading information about Austin, I felt that he was a very humble person as well. So in terms of the portrait, because I wanted to have a monumental feel in regards to his head, I did spend a lot of time augmenting it actually, because even with the photographs, they actually didn't have that intensities in terms of lighting.
The portrait has this, seems grounded in this sort of almost halo-like effect, but at the same time, it's very contemporary looking because, you know, we're seeing Austin with his dreadlocks and with his round glasses, and he was somebody who was very stylish. You know, he was somebody who had a, you know, that joie de vivre. I think that's also reflected in the image. You managed to capture an energy, but still give him this kind of reverence with that sort of halo of light that you would see in more traditional kind of European paintings.
Well, in terms of the halo, it's used as a way that most people would understand, especially people from actual different cultures.
Yeah.
So this is like having actual virtue.
Yes.
And so that was the idea, so that as people come into the gallery or into that space and see the portrait, that it would be a strong presence. And Austin in life actually was a strong presence. And so I wanted Austin to be his own icon. And in terms of the head, the face, I wanted that to be more prominent. And also other aspects of it as well was I wanted the mouth to look like his mouth. I wanted it to have that structure. And so I redid his mouth at least 3 times.
Wow.
And his dreadlocks, actually one of his daughter had said to me that make sure you paint him with his dreadlocks. And so that was something that had stuck in my head. And so I wanted to make sure it was done. All that combination of youth as well as old age was included in actually making that portrait. My big concern though was just trying to make sure that I did capture the essence of who he was. I mean, I was very consumed actually with the painting. So, I mean, I work with it every day pretty much. Once it dried, it actually changes. I went back and I added and subtract, and it was just a continual fixing and so forth, because I felt it would actually give the whole effect as well of him.
It's like the crown, right?
Yes.
In a way.
Yeah.
Austin Clarke was somebody who came from the Caribbean, came from Barbados. He broke barriers for Black writers and explored the Black and Caribbean experience in Canada, and was also a civil rights activist. And so I think that painting has a particular significance being in the Sigmund Samuel Gallery at the ROM, that, you know, having this activist who cared and advocated for Black lives is also important. And so I'm wondering what your thoughts about having this work installed at this particular moment.
We are living in a strange time.
Yeah.
I mean, I also feel, to be honest with you, if Austin was alive, I think he would be proud in terms of the Black Lives Movement.
Yeah.
I mean, he was an activist as well. So it would be something actually that would be dear to his heart.
Yes.
I feel that for a painting of Austin to be in the Sigmund Samuel Gallery, I think it's a great tribute to him. He talks about love, to actually love what you do. And you get that sense that he loved what he did, and he also encouraged people in general to love the process as well. So I think that, you know, at this particular point in time, that it is actually a fitting tribute to him.
So my last question is what you hope that visitors will respond to, or what do you hope for them to take from this portrait of Austin?
I hope actually that the viewers will try to perhaps learn more about him and get a better sense or understanding of who he was as a person. He was a man that, you know, he walked to the beat of his own drum.
By evening, We arrive with your alphabets, a hurricane through these neatly pressed and arranged things. Here is a voice, a handkerchief splitting the road, a government house. Here and there, you call the dark ones who mask their storms with hours of work, away from the yard, into old airmail envelopes. You send and meet them with leathered hands, and what will carry us beyond the sea, ceaseless, with what is left to song. Left too, like lances were left, to endlessly break the silence of dirt. Courtyards and parliaments and palaces we left, though we seldom knew the point of leaving. With all the lost habits of remembering our world-long dead ahead of us. I walk into midnight, parting the rootless streets and corners and rooms filled with the hard people in those sentences you sent, still in the brilliant costumes of your visions. I appear by the morning, a break under brimming antiphonies. It would be tempting to say this is sidelong to history, but you are here, and we too, such irrefutable evidence. Now cover our chests with rubber and repeat the speeches that haul us into a peasant's story with a touch of luxury and more. How outside can go inside as the weeds go, with wildness more than anything else, wherever they must. And all the electric things stay loving us, sometimes to curse, sometimes to carry the sea and sun porous behind you. All of the swollen passages unfurl as I haul them into mid-afternoon, one and then another, to speak as though you had delivered me here in the flesh. In a year like this, the thick anguish and sprung things adding up like the red in your tie. Soft and throwing doors open again and again. The loud, bloody bell of your pen scraping miles through the streets, as though all that can be said has been said. Because all of your letters mark the sand, and the spirits and papers, and the hand measuring years, and the words that cleave hard line to soft brow, these exact lingos of the new, disturbing all of the disorders with a music. This, like your portrait here, surprises no one. How these motions make their own weather and light up your face on this wall in ink as large and frenzied as a mother's sound, as what speaking does to the thing that hears it. Is it fitting to make a noise for you that will ring something bright and something jagged? And there is always more, where flightless birds walk into a cloud, as inland sea to rupturing shoal. And if I look upon you, still with questions, it is for a haunting, not sainthood. So I ask you, is my scrutiny a predictable stone thrown in the old waterways? Do my own eyes drown me in an elemental love out there? Must I want anything of the beaten shrines that know to hold our dreaming heads wherever you've gone? Forgive the questions. Someone is here with a notebook. Someone says, let's begin. Someone follows whoever is waiting at the door. Could be you. Or is it true you still hold the city wide open to our memberings? What more can I, a poet of problems, say? Whatever real thing is here, I hold to my dim pulse, at your likeness up on this wall. You left to the wisdoms of paint. You with no knowledge of me or that I would come decades into your future, wresting something of you away from a diminishing gumshoe. All the simple things run out of metal here and realign. Where a dirt road is no weapon, no abstract name for belonging. Here is agony, but also dancing, taxing our shoes down to a hot powder, where I put a stone on every book you ever wrote. There heaps something of the world's heavy anchor, the way they convince me to find a coast and let a wind lift all that we still carry, with the argument of your absence. I toss the luck that brings me here. So, Austin, what you doing here in this old town, wearing this old suit and this old shoe, singing this old tune, welding this old alphabet, in this place full of storm, threatening hurricane, in this old house, in this state of finest paint, in this hurricane? There's a gravelly way you say. Some of us are still alive when others of us die. And now is when to celebrate all we still carry. That is not death.
When I saw the portrait, I really liked it a lot. There's something about it. He's sparkling from the head as the giant of literary fiction that we know him to be.
It really is an energetic portrait, and it's almost like there's an internal light emanating from it. It's a really interesting experience to be with it because, you know, on the one hand, it's a naturalistic portrait, and on the other hand, there's this sort of otherworldliness to it.
I remember being a child and walking through St. Greg's Church, where I grew up, and looking up at the stained glass windows of all of the saints and just marveling at that. And when I first saw this portrait, that's how I felt. I felt like you can see that this is a depiction of somebody who is not necessarily here, but it almost feels that they're filling a space with this energy.
My hope is that when someone comes into the gallery and stands in front of the portrait of Austin Clarke, that not only will they think about the man and think about the ideas and think about the aesthetics of the picture, but that they'll feel something about the individual, about the institution, about themselves, and then they will take that with them when they leave.
She pulls the white cloth or the canvas blanket from the head, and she sees the face and identifies it. First thing, she says to herself as she rests her hand on the stretcher bearing his body, first thing is to call Pastor James. Pastor James will give him a good turnout. And it will be next Sunday, and it will be a large funeral, leaving from the basement and coming up these front steps and leading up to Yonge Street, along Shooter, down Dundas, past Dundas Square, past Sherbourne Street, going through the neighborhood where he lived, like a funeral procession back home. But I want this one to look like a demonstration that we used to have in Island Gardens, the park just north of here, against racial discrimination. And I want them to play music, The music will be Sometimes I Feel Like a Motherless Child, and then Poverty is Hell. And Pastor James will be at the head of the procession, and I will beat my tambourine, and I want saxophone music and slow drum beat, and all the sex workers, the man with the walker, and the crack users will join in. And like this, the parade of sadness, the procession of his death, will go along Shooter, north up Yonge Street, swing east along Dundas Street. The parade of death will flow like a broad, slow river, east down Dundas Street, with me holding the doll I made of BJ, dressed like a student of Trinity College in the university, close to my heart, close, close, carrying it in my 2 hands. This is the day of rejoicing and of death. The Lord giveth, and the Lord taketh away. And I will dress his body myself, give it its preparation bath, things I have learned from my mother. The chain I gave him for his 13th birthday, I will take off his neck. After I bathe him, I put scents and mothballs in the proper places, as my mother taught me. And I will present the silver chain and cross to Josephine, and keep the star and crescent. I will wear it round my neck to remember him by, and I will ask Mrs. Proposky and Sila to walk in front of the coffin, behind Pastor James, and I will invite the ladies of the night and the sex workers and all the homeless men to join in this remembering of him, making his final journey longer and bigger, because we will be walking from here, from my basement apartment, all the way to the Apostolicals, as if it is a civil rights demonstration. And all my babies, my other children, will be on the coffin as it is pulled along the road on wheels. I will hold Mr. Rashanan, if you please, firmly to my breast, formerly known as BJ, in my 2 hands, close to my chest. All I have to do now is call Pastor James and make the arrangements. And the 3rd hymn I want for him is, The day thou gavest, Lord, is ended. Yes.
The portrait of Austin Clarke is a very important piece for us both to have commissioned and also to be presenting in our galleries. And having this portrait here helps us understand the Black role in Canadian life and Canadian history, and is a very fitting place for a portrait like that to be able to undergird the story of Blackness in Canadian society as a nation of diverse peoples. And so having that picture here in the ROM says something very important about both Clarke himself and his relevance to Canadian society and literature and civil rights issues, but it also says something about what we're trying to do here at the ROM.
Because it's such a highly visible painting and such a highly visible member of the Black Canadian community, I think that's one way of really indicating of where we want to go and are making steps to go.
And so I think that it's important to have this particular work by a Black Canadian artist, of a Black Canadian artist, because, you know, we have been underrepresented within major institutions, and so I see this as a positive move in terms of equity and inclusion.
This really signals to the Black community here that the ROM is at least a place that's willing to see us, open to having us, and to build in a deeper and longer lasting relationship with Black communities.
When visitors come to see that Austin Clarke is represented within that canon, and they see a Black man looking back at them, smiling with that whimsical, glint in his eye, knowingly to say that I was here and I made a mark.
I think it's fitting that Austin Clarke has a place in the museum. To have the ROM acknowledge that, is in a sense fulfilling something of Austin's own prophecy. So
it's more recently in my own life and career in Toronto that I have become to appreciate that legacy that I'm talking about that he left behind. And that's really why it's cool to be here, is to encourage people who come here from another cultural experience to Canada, speaking a different way, worshiping maybe in a different way, but who know that they have something that the Canadian literary world and the world in general needs to hear. I hope that this portrait being here is part of carrying on that legacy for that generation.
Austin always had immense dignity, and I caught a glimpse of how hard-won that dignity was and how necessary it was. But I also think that Austin Clarke might express the sense that, you know what, it's about time.